I have the great pleasure of being the moderator for this panel discussion. Many of you are already familiar with the RESEMBID program. It is funded by the European Union and implemented through Expertise France, which is the French government International Development Cooperation Agency. This program offers a demand-driven and bottom-up approach to technical assistance for the 12 Caribbean overseas countries and territories and British overseas territories, aiming at strengthening environmentally sustainable economic development. Back in 2021, RESEMBID launched a virtual OCT community of practice. We are now kicking off the third series of this forum. So the purpose of the community of practice is to create a dedicated virtual space to facilitate the sharing and exchange of ideas, knowledge, and practices between the overseas countries and territories. The community of practice provides an opportunity for grantees or soon to be grantees to share experiences on how they are currently or they're planning to use this program. So at this point, the program will take the opportunity to acknowledge our implementing partners, first and foremost, the 12 Caribbean overseas countries and territories, the European Union as the donor, Expertise France as lead program implementation partner, and the World Bank and GFDRR as implementation partner of the disaster risk financing and insurance technical assistance component of RESEMBID. This week, our community of disaster risk management practitioners has lost one of its champions. It is with great sadness we heard of the passing of Mr. Calvin Andre Samuel, Director of Disaster Management Anguilla. So he will be greatly missed. Before we move on to the panelists, I would now like to invite the RESEMBID Director of Program, Mr. Fabian McKinnon, to deliver some opening remarks. Over to you, Fabian.
Thank you, Edward. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon if anyone is joining from the other side of the pond. It's a pleasure to open another session of our communities of practice, which have been extremely popular, extremely well received, and I think that is because there is a real need to focus on these three things. I'll just say a word or two about these three key words: community, resilience, and practice. As Edward said, the purpose of these meetings and the purpose of our seeking to foster the building of these communities is indeed to create in an active way a space where it's possible to exchange not just on information and knowledge, but to actually exchange on practice. And that's, I think, the key word that it's easy to underestimate. Resilience is, of course, is a concept that originates in psychology, and it does speak to arguably a human being's ultimate skill, which is the skill for survival, the skill to prepare, to withstand, to recover, and ideally to avoid major disruptions or shocks. But because the concept is so organic, so complex, and because the concept is so cross-cutting in a society, that it be informed by how that society manages risk and how that society actually can be further developed, can further advance its capacity to do that is not only central, but it's what is particularly challenging. In other words, all activities in societal development need to be informed by practice, going well beyond research. But none is more dependent on an astute, a pragmatic enrichment by how things actually work out in real life, how things really work out in practice in that society. And as we know, the readiness of that society to prepare, to withstand, to recover, and ideally to avoid shock is extremely complex and extremely challenging. We've seen some of the wealthiest societies that this planet has to struggle horrendously with a pandemic. So it's challenging by any standard. And the beauty of an event like this is that each person brings an extremely valuable perspective on, as I say, how things work in practice. Yes, everyone here is conversant with the research, with the best knowledge, and that's fantastic, and that must inform our thinking. But it's not enough, and so I urge everyone today to go beyond just the technical, and to be very free to share their own experiences on how things really have worked out in their observation. And that is what is most pragmatic and most usable to the OCT and to us as a program of technical assistance, so that we can continue to inform what we do and continue to inform our dialogue with all of you and those who are not here, to make programs more effective. So I won't take more of your time. I wish you a fantastically productive session, and be free and generous with questions during and after. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fabian. Now for a few housekeeping matters. First, I'll ask you to ensure your microphones are muted. There'll be an opportunity, as Fabian mentioned, to hear from different experiences, even beyond the overseas countries and territories, and for questions and answers following the contributions from the panelists. As you may have noticed, that the full session is being recorded, and it will be made available on request and shared with those who were not able to make it today. So today we are very, very fortunate to have three distinguished panelists with deep interest in the topic of today, which is early warning and early action. As a reminder, tomorrow, Thursday 13th, will be the International Day of Disaster Risk Reduction 2022. So quite a momentous day to be thinking about this issue. Instead of individual presentations, we'll prefer the format of a moderated discussion with questions put to each speaker. Before we dive into the early warning systems in the overseas countries and territories, we have the guest panelist from the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR in short. Many of you will already know Mr. Jair Torres. We will then get to know more about the specific context and approach of Sint Maarten from Ms. Angelique Gums, Manager of the Department of the Interior and Kingdom Relations with the Ministry of General Affairs of the Government of Sint Maarten. Angelique will be followed by Mr. Reno Hermans, Director of the Crisis Management Office and National Crisis Coordinator of Aruba. We're also very fortunate today to have among us other distinguished guests with relevant experience in early warning systems. So I encourage you all to contribute with your perspectives. And I'll also call on my colleague, Ms. Judy Clark, to share some thoughts on some of the gender dimensions to early warning and early action. So this introduction out of the way, and with Jair's kind permission, we will start the next segment with a couple of short videos from UNDRR that were prepared in the context of the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction 2022. So these are very short clips of a little over a minute each. I will show them one after the other, and then we'll come back to Jair. Thank you. And now I'd like to turn to our first panelist. Thank you for joining us, Jair. You are an advisor with UNDRR's Regional Office for the Americas and the Caribbean. UNDRR's mission is to provide leadership and support to accelerate global efforts in disaster risk reduction, to achieve inclusive sustainable development and the goal of the Sendai framework. The regional office provides support to actors throughout the region, fostering a culture of disaster prevention and building disaster resilient nations and communities. The short clips we just viewed introduce some of the key messages about the case for greater investment in early warning systems, the 4 key pillars, and the importance of end-to-end and people-centered approaches. My first question to you is the following. What are some of the big challenges we are facing in this area specifically of disaster preparedness?
Thank you, Edward, and thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation from UNDRR. It's always a pleasure to work with RESEMBID and with the colleagues, that are sponsoring your initiative. And thank you for this starting the webinar with these clicks that we have been preparing and that really try to put in context what we are talking when we talk about multi-hazard early warning systems. Your question is very pertinent, I believe, or we believe, that the region has been improving a lot in terms of really advancing on the design, development, implementation, and monitoring of multi-hazard early warning systems. Nevertheless, we still have many challenges. I will resume this challenge on 2 big groups. The first challenge is concerning that we had a vision of these 4 elements. When we talk about early warning system, normally we talk about understanding the risk. So that means understanding the hazard, the exposure, the vulnerability, social and physical of our populations. This is the first element. The second element is about monitoring and forecasting. So having the capacity to monitor and forecasting a hazard and understand when the hazard will be triggering on impact. The third element is warning dissemination. So how we're gonna send the communications to all of the different individuals, communities, and institutions that are available to respond. And the 4 elements is about the response capabilities. So not that, the capacities and capabilities that individuals, communities, and institutions will have in order to really go from early warning to early actions. And these 4 elements, one of the things that we have realized with the times is that those 4 elements are missing sometimes an element that is the most important, that is the governance approach, how you link all of these 4 elements together in order to ensure that there is really synergies among the different actors that are working on the inclusion of the 4 elements. For instance, between science institutions that are, providing more knowledge and more understanding about the risks, the hazards, the exposure, the vulnerability, the scientific institutions that are in charge of monitoring and forecasting, those that are in charge of disseminating the warning, not only at the governmental level in terms to say like who is responsible for what, but through channels like communications, the CAP Common Alerting Protocol. I'm very happy to see Elliot here within the panel, and also about the response capabilities. There is a link that was missing before, and is the governance approach. How really involve and how we really integrate this in a concept that put us all together and put us to talk the same language. Nowadays, we are facing systemic risks. That with COVID was very evident. Before COVID, it was very difficult for many people to understand what systemic risks were. But after COVID, now we understand these cascading impacts that different hazards, for instance, that started with a biological hazard, can create on other hazards like social hazards. And that you have to be living in the context of the exposure to a biological hazards, for instance, on the hurricane season, so being prone to hydrometeorological hazards, or living with geological hazards. That was the case on St. Vincent and the Grenadines, that you have COVID, so biological hazards, you have to be facing the hurricane season, hydrometeorological hazards, and second, trying to really live with the geological hazards. So how you have a multi-hazard approach to really ensure that the different strategies are coordinating to see what we have systemic risk. So we need a systemic approach to have these things. So this is the first challenge, like really the governance approach, the governance understanding of how we need to work together in order to really ensure that early warning will bring early action. The second challenge that we will have still is concerning this narrow understanding about what early warning systems are. We have this traditional understanding of early warning systems that come from the 70s and 80s that are really related about the technical capacities, equipment, satellites, radars, sensors, which are very important as they are. But we can have the best early warning systems with the best equipment, the best technology, the best people. But if this is not translated on action, we are not doing our job. And this is something that we saw, for instance, that was a big lesson after the cyclone of 1991 in Bangladesh, where the Met Office was able to really to monitor and forecast the cyclone, provide a good early warning, but many people didn't take actions. And this is where we need to focus our effort. Why people don't take actions? What are the social constraints, the cultural aspects, the trust on the institutions, not only on the message, but also on the messenger, who is providing this message. So we need to start understanding how people perceive risk, how people perceive early warning systems, and what are the conditions to improve that people, communities, and institutions can respond effectively when a warning is produced. And I will resume this two challenge, like the major challenge that we are now trying to cover and to move forward. One of the strategies for that is to pass from traditional early warning systems to impact-based forecasting. So let's say those early warning systems that are notably focused on the hazard, try to pass it to be focused on the impact. I'm gonna put it like that. I always put this example, and my mother, I know that she will kill me when I say that. But if you say to my mother that a Hurricane 5 is coming, she will say 5 over 20, over 100, 5 over how many? I don't understand. But if we say to her, like, look at, there is a hurricane and the possibility that the school where you work is that it will be flooded, so classes will be closed, and there are many people that will not be able to come to work. There are some commerce that will be closed, maybe some restrictions, maybe some flooding of 1, 2, 3 meters. Maybe when I have a lot of winds that can impact your windows. So then is when my mother will start understanding, like, now I understand these things. So we need to pass to do this transition from the traditional early warning that is focused on the hazard to more information that is focused on the impact that the hazard will do. My colleagues meteorologists always will say this is not to talk about what the weather is, but what the weather will do. And this is something that we need to do this transition on that in order to overcome this challenge, in order to improve the response capabilities, and all of this, of course, improving the governance mechanisms that we will have for that. Over to you, Edward.
Thank you. So I talked about this this global initiative, which is tomorrow is another opportunity to emphasize this. Could you tell us a little bit more about this initiative that was launched by the Secretary General this year for early warning and early action for all, and more specifically the role that UNDRR is playing globally, but more particularly in the region and in the overseas countries and territories?
Okay, thank you, Edward. Well, let me put it in that way. The Secretary General has big ambitions, and I think that this is why we are very happy with him. But that means that we really need to work all together, because early warning systems and disaster risk reduction is everybody's business. So as you may know, now that you mentioned the Secretary General in the International Day of the Meteorology, he made a call and actually he engaged the United Nations systems and all the stakeholders, involved stakeholders, not only the UN, but donors, community, and other stakeholders, to really ensure that in the next 5 years, every single person in the earth will be covered by an early warning system. And that was mean these things, that we need to ensure that that person will be covered by early warning systems for all of the hazards that he's exposed, not only hydrometeorological hazards, important as they are, and notably knowing the impacts that climate change will have, the negative impacts in the increases of intensities, as we have seen these months, for instance, with Hurricane Ian, Hurricane and tropical cyclone Julia. So we see the intensities being bigger, but now we need to also don't take out, any other important cluster hazards like the biological hazards. We need to be sure that we integrate biological components on there. Geological hazards, be the Caribbean region is very exposed to volcanoes, to tsunamis, and to earthquakes. And sometimes we stay only focused on the hurricane season, and we forgot that we are in an area that we are very prone to earthquakes. The earthquake of Haiti in 2010 is a big call. And then the earthquake on 2020 is also a big call that we need to start working on that. So the Secretary General put us this task. Now he has requested WMO to prepare a plan that is going to be presented now in the COP 27 in Egypt. So there is a plan on how we're going to be working together, all the UN system with other partners in order to ensure that in the next 5 years, we're going to be designing, developing, and implementing and monitoring these early warning systems. The role of UNDRR in this plan is to ensure that we really have the multi-hazard approach, that we really are talking not only about the specific hazard, but that we are talking about, all of the aspects of all of the different hazards that has been divided. Like last year, the International Council of Science, together with UNDRR, they create a group of experts on which one we have really categorized the taxonomy of hazards. So we identify nowadays 302 hazards that are all around the world that we are exposed, and other regions more than other ones, depending where are you located. And we catalog that in 8 big clusters. So our idea is to be sure that, we don't focus only on one specific early warning system, but we have the multi-hazard approach. And the second role of UNDRR is to ensure that governance approach. Ensure that multi-hazard early warning systems are really embedded in the national strategies for disaster risk reduction, better known in the Caribbean region, in the CDMA system, like country work programs. Ensure that they are part of the national adaptation plans, an important document that is out of the Paris Agreement, and ensure that they are really an important and core part of national development strategies, because there is not development and there is not sustainable development if we don't put risk at the core of the development. We have the big example of Haiti, for many years they didn't have any earthquake. There were many people saying, we should risk inform our investments in order to ensure that in the case of an earthquake, something will happen. And many people will say but earthquakes don't happen here very often. I don't have memory of that. So there were a lot of investments that were not really risk informed and they were not resilient. And that jeopardized the development of the country. And this is something that is part of the responsibility of UNDRR, is to ensure that that we have the multi-hazard approach and that we ensure that the governance is there in all and is connected. Is not only like something that is related to disaster reduction. Disaster reduction is everybody's business, and this is one of the responsibilities that we have, is to raise awareness on this specific point. Over to you, Edward.
Yes, when the UN Secretary General made this call during the World Meteorological Day back in March, he was also, I think they released some of the findings of some work done on reviewing the multi-hazard early warning systems around the world, and they found that only roughly a third of small island developing states actually have reported having a multi-hazard early warning system. Maybe could you share a little bit about some of the initiatives underway in this region specifically? You mentioned CDMA's work, but also maybe more specifically with the overseas countries and territories, if you could share some of the work that's underway currently.
Sure. Now we have in the context of the Caribbean region, we have been working on what we call the CRUISE Caribbean Initiative. The CRUISE is the Climate Risk Early Warning Systems Initiative. So there is a big fund that was created, one of the outcomes out of the Paris Agreement negotiations, and create this fund on which major donors, notably from Europe and North America, such as Canada, but also in Asia like Japan, has contributed with some funding to support small island development states in developing multi-hazard early warning systems. As you have mentioned, one of the issues that we have is only 33% of the small islands development states has reported to have early warning systems. And sometimes when they report, I have to be very autocritic here. Some of them only report on a specific hazard or a specific cluster that is hydrometeorological hazard, but they don't report about the other hazards like the geological or the biological or technological, etc. So one of the ideas that we are doing in the framework of this project is really strengthening the capacities of different Caribbean countries, including overseas territories that are part of the CDIMA participating states. So through the CDIMA participating states, we are able to support those that are part of the CDIMA system. For instance, like San Martin, for instance, Cayman Islands, and other overseas territories that are part of the CDIMA systems, and we are supporting on different aspects. Together with the World Bank, we are supporting on a strategic, so on a strategic vision about where we should go, strategic initiatives about where we should go. With WMO, we are supporting on also equipment, but also as well on supporting the Met offices in everything that is related to capacities for analyzing and forecasting different hazards. And from the perspective of UNDRR, as I mentioned, we are working on linking this at the policy level, ensuring that every single country has a country work program, a national strategy for DRR, where multi-hazard early warning systems are part of it. Also ensuring that the country has a roadmap for the implementation of multi-hazard early warning systems. For some of these countries, that they have a policy on which one we can ensure that, you know, everybody has a clear role and responsibility and mandate, but also that the necessary budget, because it's very, very important. Sometimes we have wonderful policy documents, wonderful strategies, but if we don't have the money, we are leaving things out. So to ensuring that we have really the finances, that is important. We are also supporting countries to better understand how people perceive risk and how perceive early warning systems in order to better tackle those elements, cultural aspects. You know, sometimes in some countries, there are some countries that still are very, you know, following a very patriarchal culture on which when women do not take decision if men are not at home. So we are trying to tackle in order to see how we can provide support to policy in order that improve the capacities and empower women in order to take action in the case of a specific hazard. Similarly, we are working on supporting the different countries on developing a live repository of data of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability in order that we can do this transition from traditional early warning systems to impact-based forecasting. So we have a series of activities that are within the framework of this project and that will benefit overseas territories, as is the case now of San Martin, the Cayman Islands, Anguilla, and other ones in the region. Over to you, Edward.
Yeah, thank you, Jair. You also mentioned CDIMA. I see that we have Clive has joined the meeting today, so welcome. This is really a great way for you to introduce this forum and us to get to know more about what is taking place and where OCTs can turn to for more technical assistance. So thank you very much for sharing this today. We will now hear for St. Martin. Thank you for joining us, Angelique. Your role with the Ministry of General Affairs means you are an interface, and if you allow me, a DRR advocate between the different initiatives to strengthen St. Martin's disaster risk management capacity. Since Hurricane Irma and Maria back in 2017, the government has spearheaded multiple initiatives in this regard. What can you tell us about St. Martin's resolve to act on early warnings for all?
Hi, Edward. Morning. Good morning to everyone. Hi, Jair. I recently returned from Guyana with the workshop on the Muse early warning system from the UNDRR. It was a great workshop. I think we did some good work there. So yeah, St. Martin's resolve to act on early warning systems stems from the experiences of Hurricanes Irma and Maria in 2017. In 2017, we were devastated by those hurricanes. Hurricane Irma was a Category 5 hurricane, followed by Hurricanes Maria. So let me just give you some context while I'm explaining. St. Martin is 37 square miles. It's half Dutch, half French. We have an open border. You can just drive over it. It's free. It's very much open. We are very small. but we're also located on the hurricane belt. We have high population density. We are flood-prone country as well. And St. Martin is also very hilly in the sense that we have a lot of mountains. Now, leading up to the hurricanes of 2017, we had no warning system in place in the sense of a siren system or something of the sort. We did have sirens prior to that. However, they were damaged and they were no longer in use for several other reasons as well. So what we noticed was in lessons learned from Hurricanes Irma and Maria, preparation is key. Having your society, your population, your communities prepare is key. So St. Martin is also a one-pillar economy, meaning we have a lot of tourists on island at any given point in time. That also played a very critical role, not only in the response, but also in preparation. In 2020, St. Martin also experienced the pandemic. It was a worldwide event. And the lessons that we learned there, again, preparation is key. We noticed that messaging was not penetrating into, let's just say, the vulnerable communities, mainly also migrant communities, communities where maybe the language is not predominantly English, where the language is maybe Spanish or Creole, and the messages it was just not getting through. So we had to be creative and we had to find ways and means to get to those communities. One of the things that we did at the time was a speaker car. Very simple, very plain, car, speaker on the top. Drive around in the community, messaging in different languages so that the community can also consume those messages. So it then dawned that we are in dire need of an end-to-end early warning system, starting with, as Jer said, a governance structure and a governance framework, because we also need to know clear what are the roles and responsibilities, who are responsible, who will do what will be the triggers of an early warning system. That governance framework will also allow us to anchor early warning in a more structural manner, in a more sustainable manner as well. So that is why we opted for an end-to-end design of early warning systems and to look beyond technology. It's not just about having a siren system, because if you have a siren system, but your population does not know what to do, then you defeat the purpose. Or if you have a messaging system, but your population does not know how to interpret that message, you defeat the purpose. So it has to also be multi-hazard as well. As Jair mentioned, it cannot just be hurricanes. We have to take all the risk into consideration. Tsunamis, we now have the pandemic that has been added to it as well. So we would like, from the perspective of St. Martin, to have a system as well where the various emergency services are also centralized. Not that one emergency service knows what, knows when, and knows how, but that the other doesn't. Or that one emergency service reacts, but that the other doesn't. So hence the desire to create an end-to-end early warning system for St. Martin.
So this is something that you're also trying to address through a project that's currently in its final stages of preparation with RESEMBID. And in this project, it's very much about taking a strategic and holistic approach to the early warning systems. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of these elements that you've prioritized for this project?
The elements that we've prioritized for this project is the governance structure, first and foremost. Structure will outline a framework in which we can work. And the governance structure is very significant because we are also currently busy with the development of our disaster risk management policy. As Shahir also mentioned, financing is also critical for such systems. We are also in the development phase of our disaster risk financing strategy. So this way, St. Martin is filling all the gaps in its disaster management structure. With regards to the project, one of the beautiful areas of this project is messaging. For me, it is messaging. Messaging in various language, messaging through various mediums, including signage. Signage that can be placed in flood-prone areas, signage that can be placed in areas that are low-lying along the coast, so that persons know what to do and when to do. For me, it's also critical that the community understands, how should I say, reliable sources. Because one of the things that we've also seen, there is somewhat of a lack of trust. Nowadays, you can get information from anywhere, but it's also critical for the community to understand what is the reliable source and for government to also create that trust so that in the event there is an incident or an hazard, that the community knows this is the source that I need to be at, this is the message that I'm going to get and what I need to do and how I need to react. So that's, for me, those are the key parts of the project going forward.
Thank you. And could you tell us also about how you're collaborating with regional initiatives, but also other countries and territories? I'm thinking particularly the example with French Saint-Martin, so the other side of this beautiful island.
Okay, so we are collaborating with French Saint-Martin, indeed. One of the other projects actually that we have with Saint-Martin is the radar project. It's a meteorological radar that is being erected on the Dutch side of St. Martin, but will also serve on the French side. That project will finalize at the end of 2022. So I'm very much looking forward to that. It also relates very much to the early warning systems project. And it will also serve the neighboring islands where weather is concerned. So that project is also an EU-funded project. And that project, we are very much looking forward to kicking it off and getting it started, basically. So that's a good collaboration. Another collaboration that we have happening, and I have to thank Shahir for that, is that where early warning system is concerned through the Sendai framework and the CDEM, they have been instrumental in also helping us develop the project proposal for the early warning system. It is through those workshops that we have had that we are able to see and learn from each other as well. And it is because of that we've also established somewhat of a network for all the OCTs where we can discuss them. So I have quite some islands where we are already collaborating on early warning systems and some other disaster management aspects that we've discussed at the workshops, of course. But early warning systems really was a central discussion. The good thing about the collaboration is we can learn from each other because we are very much alike and very much different. And those differences is where we learn from each other.
Thank you, Angelique. And I would like to also salute the Prime Minister Sylvia Jacobs and the government for your resolve to act on early warnings for all. Back in September, I saw that St. Martin, alongside other representatives from the OCTs, were in New York, sharing the voice of this region. Adjustments. I just wanted to pick up on something that Angelique just mentioned as far as the issue of lack of trust. And I think this is actually a point that was also brought up by other OCTs. I'm thinking particularly back in 2017, so a few years ago, at the Multi-Hazard Early Warning Conference in Mexico, the then Deputy Director of the Disaster Management Department, Mr. Damien Barker, made a presentation on the specific case of Anguilla. And he was explaining about the experience with Common Alerting Protocol and the fact that they're one of the first in the region, and they have one of the longest running CAPs for multi-hazard early warning system. And the point of trust was actually something that he brought up among the challenges for their multi-hazard early warning system. and the actual challenge and difficulties in gaining the trust of communities, and how it's so, the whole issue of reputation of your warning system, how important it is to have clear frameworks, to have those policies in place to protect the system and ensure it can function and that it can be maintained by the government. This was a point that he was making back then during the Multi-Hazard Early Warning Conference of 2017. We also want to call on some of the resource people that we have present today in this forum. And one person I'd like to I may not be introducing Judy to you, many of you already know her, but I think this is also very relevant as far as picking up on one of the points on gender that was brought up earlier. So Judy, Ms. Judy Clark with us, thank you for joining us today. You are based in the region and you've been providing advisory services on the topics of climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and gender mainstreaming to many of the Caribbean countries and territories. And the RESEMBID program has been very fortunate of benefiting from your independent analysis and guidance since 2019 now. So a recurring topic is leaving no one behind and the importance of community participation in DRR matters. Why is it so important to consider gender dimensions to achieve early warning and early action for all?
Sure. Yeah, so disasters affect women, girls, boys, and men differently, since these groups may face different levels of exposure to the hazard and also face different factors that influence risk, like their participation in discussions and solutions around disaster risk reduction, social marginalization, I think of migrants, legal and otherwise, and of course their capacities to respond. And then within these groups are subpopulations, so persons with disabilities and those who are poor and very poor. So all these factors combine to determine how a person experiences hazards. So that's why it's really important to, to have these vulnerability factors, gender being a primary one, to be taken into consideration in the design of early warning systems. And the result would be that risk communication, preparedness, response measures are targeted and more effective in reducing the adverse impacts on a greater number of persons and possibly even save more lives. And ultimately, that is the purpose of early warning systems.
Thank you. I'll be coming back to you for you to maybe share some of the challenges that you've observed in this region. Now I'd like to go back to Reno. Hi, Reno. So I was asking if you could give us a brief description of your early warning system and what have been some of the challenges you've faced with early warning and early action in Aruba. Over to you.
Okay, Edward, thank you for having me. Good morning and good afternoon in Europe. I go back to the history before we reach today. It is important for everybody, every country to know that the technological part of early warning is the last part of the total package in early warning. As Jair said, by having the equipment and taking no action, early action is the same as having nothing. What we did in Aruba was making our risk chart, after that our impact chart, and after that our capacity of response in case of any of the 23 risks that Aruba have on the risk chart. By the risk, some we can mitigate, some we cannot. The impact, we have to have a response plan that we make. And when we reach the capacity, we notice that we are a small island with a small capacity of first responder. We step up our game, no one left behind, not only in saving lives, but in responding capacity is no one will left behind. There we start with our Aruba incident management system. Instead of the vertical response chain of command, we went horizontal. So your first line of defense is gonna be the same motto: no one left behind. So no one will lose life on Aruba in an incident, but everyone have to help in an incident in case of. After that, if you take our geographical Aruba, all our action is taking part in the Southwest. So the tourist sector, 80% of our workforce is in the Southwest. All our food supply chain is in the Southwest. After that, in 2016, we started with building up capacity on the island to protect our health institution. Only one hospital on the island. So if we can protect the hospital capacity, we can save more lives. And by taking early action, we can calculate that we have about 30% of the job done and 60% of the economy safe. And then we're talking about Aruba resilience. After that, we start to seeking for the early warning technological part. There we meet only about 37% of Aruba have a smartphone. So it was not only an option to send a series of SMS. So we have been seeking for expertise, seeking for financial support. And over there, I can tell everybody from all the other countries, if you're gonna start this journey of an early warning, you have to have expertise. And we was lucky to have Judy helping us making this project. It is not an easy task because, like Jair said in the beginning, it is not the technological part of the early warning thinking of the 70s and the 80s. It is, you can have the best equipment of the world, but if your community is not prepared to respond after an early warning and take early action, you can have the best equipment, but you don't gonna get the result as disaster coordinator that you want to get. That is saving at least 70% of your economy. We are the Caribbean, small economy. Aruba is one pillar, tourist. And after that, you can see, communicate with your community, educate them. It is all for one for all. So the disaster management can have all the equipment, all the gear, all the expertise, all the planning, but if the community don't help itself, we are nowhere. And that's why early warning for us in Aruba, in our planning, was the last part. And RESEMBID was at the right moment when we was seeking for the financial part to finance our last part of the Aruba Resilience 2030.
Yeah,
that was
thank
a
you.
short brief, Edward.
Thank you, Reno. Yeah, one point I'd like to bring up here is that several of the overseas countries and territories have implemented phone-based alerting systems, whereby people can download an application on their mobile phones and receive warnings that way. And you have specific experience with that. You touched on it very briefly. Could you share that experience with the system and maybe some of the limitations that you experience and how you're seeing, what kind of solutions you see actually to that lesson learned?
Okay, Aruba have experience with early warning. That was in 2010 when we make what Jair pointed to in the introduction. That was an SMS-based early warning in 2010 when we promoted in the public outreach. We got from a community in 2010 of 96,000, only 400 members registered to receive early warning from the disaster management office of the crisis management office. So this time we didn't make the same mistake. We said, okay, we're gonna take some adjustment to outreach most of the community. After that is the era of WhatsApp. So we used WhatsApp as the cheapest outway to get in communication with everybody. And in crisis communication, you have to have credibility of your information, and your communication have to be on top. Over there, we are in the social media war in these days. So you have to have a credibility so that people can move on the information you disseminate to them. So WhatsApp is the cheapest outgo if you have nothing, but the credibility is not on the level that we want as government and as crisis management office. So we had experience in 2010. SMS didn't work. In 2016, we adjust our national planning to response. No one left behind. And after that, now we are in the execution phase of the technical part, the credibility of the government, the credibility of the early warning. So most people country have to consider social media is faster than the government's department. So when you decimate early warning that there is 100,000 already outside there, so the credibility, you have to work on the credibility too to get the early warning. If you 60% of resilience capacity in your response plan.
Thank you, Rino. Yeah, no, this is, I think Aruba gives a really good illustration of the potential of some of these technologies, but also some of the limitations, and that they need to fit in with a much broader framework, and as was pointed out earlier as well, that they need to be socialized with those that they target, and there needs to be ownership and a sense of ownership of these tools and system. Okay, we've just had the opportunity to hear from some of the regional initiatives and from two of the Caribbean OCTs. I thank all three panelists for sharing these experiences, and maybe now I'd like to open it up to some contributions, to some questions, so that so some of the people that have joined today may put these questions. I will. You can use, so if you want to ask a question, please use the raise your hand function, which is in the top bar of your screen. If you look at under reactions, if you click that button, you have a hands up sign. If you want to ask a question or you want to contribute with a comment, please do so now. I see Laurie Ray has raised her hand. Thank you. You can also choose, if you don't want to ask this question directly that way, you can also use the chat function. So if you click on the chat button in the same bar, you can put that question in writing or that comment in writing to the panelists. So we have a first point from Laurie Ray and then Simon as well. So Laurie, over to you.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Morning, Edward. It's more of a comment. I want to thank the panelists for the information provided this morning. I found the three perspectives really interesting, but what I found a bit more of interest was the use Aruba's approach, understanding their reach. I find often these days we think that everyone has access to certain tools that we use, and we sometimes forget those who don't have access. So I found that very interesting. And it would have earthed out of the fact that you would need to look at your data and see how far your reach would be in terms of communicating with your target audience. I also like the approach where you look at the early warning systems in totality, the governance of it. And I'm really interested to hear more of what St. Martin, I think, is doing as they look at the system in its totality as opposed to pieces. So I want to commend them and continue to be part of hearing about how the systems work. Because not only in disaster and early warning systems, but if we on a whole take a collaborative approach and a structured approach to what we do, I think a lot more things can be done with a lot less. Thanks very much and all the best.
Thank you, Laurie. Let's take another question or comment from Simon. Over to you, Simon.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the presentation as well. And in Keman, we have a comment actually. We've been using a mobile app which we launched back in March of this year. We're up to, I think, 5,000 or 6,000 subscribers out of our total population of 70,000, and that followed a radio interrupt system for radio stations back in 2019, and complements our existing mechanisms of social media and our website and things like that. But one of the things I wanted to mention is our kind of delivery mechanism, and that's the Joint Communication Service, which pulls together communicators from across government into a single, very effective, clear voice. And so we have 20 or 30 communicators coming together in a crisis. And I think that's why Cayman probably had one of the highest vaccination rates in the world. Obviously, the UK supported that with access to vaccines, but the messaging is extremely clear. What I do think is missing from our perspective is, while the delivery mechanisms are fairly effective, what we find is there's weakness in the risk analysis. I've mentioned it to Jer before. There are tools out there like NOAA's Tsunami Coastal Assessment Tool and the internet-based community modeling tool, but there's no training on it, or at least not since 2019. So, while the messages are coming out from the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center, we've got no idea what impact it's going to have on our coastline. In some areas, we've got very, narrow shelf area, but they're talking about cutting stairs in the size of this vertical bluff face for the school because we're very flat in many areas. There's nowhere for them to go, and the kids are probably going to injure themselves scrambling up the side of a cliff because we'll receive these warnings, but we don't even know if the threat is real, and we don't really have access to the capacity, the big supercomputers to model things like storm surge, storm-driven waves. So I think, and from what I can see, this is a problem just not of Cayman alone. The actual knowledge of the specific impact-based risks is very low. These matrices where we look at risks are just not cutting it. I look at history, every single one of these storms, it's the worst thing that ever happened. There's never been a worse storm. We just are not anticipating the risks. So no matter how good our mechanisms are to deliver it and communicate, if we don't know what we're talking about, it's not much use. So I think there needs to be a concerted across-the-board effort to ensure that all Caribbean islands have the tools to model rainfall, flooding, storm surge, wave impacts, not just the height of the wave, but the wavelength. Boats are flipping up in the channels because we're telling them, it's going to be a 3-foot wave, and then you got a really long swell, and boom, over they're going. I just think the risk analysis, as I said again, I'm a bit repeating myself. It's a real lack.
Thank you, Simon.
Yep.
Now that's an excellent point, and it's a point that actually was made by SEDIMA's executive director back in May at the third multi-hazard early warning conference in Bali, Indonesia, when she was reflecting on the 2022 regional synthesis report that was derived from the checklist used in 7 of the participating states. And what came out from that research was that there's some recurring themes in the Caribbean, yeah, and which suggests, as was pointed out earlier by Hayed, about the systemic challenges. But among those three areas that she highlighted during that presentation, the first one was limited risk knowledge. It goes back to what you're saying. This is a big challenge and something that still needs to be addressed. And that's one of the four elements that Hayed mentioned. Risk knowledge is one of the key pillars for this whole early warning system framework to function effectively. So limited risk knowledge, something definitely needs that deserves further attention in order to be able to design those more effective end-to-end systems and more people-centric systems. So yeah, and just to point out another point, the second point that she brought up, a common area in the Caribbean was barriers to data sharing, which is a central thing. We've had a chance also discussing with all the overseas countries and territories. Okay, Laurie, you mentioned a point about the early warning system in its totality as presented by St. Martin. And Angelique, did you want to mention something about that, particularly in relation to the project that we are currently developing? Did you want to share? Did you want to bounce back on that point? So Laurie was talking about that she liked the point you're making about the need to actually look at early warning systems in its globality and in a comprehensive way.
Yeah, so I think hearing Jair as well as Reno from Aruba, I think one thing that we can agree on, or one thing that we have consensus on, is that it's not just about the technology. The technology is the least of it. We've just heard the possibility of SMS and then persons not having smartphones. So the technology is sort of your last stop. With regards to end-to-end early warning system for St. Martin, the project has several aspects in it. And one of the aspects for this project is also a study for St. Martin, because similar to Aruba, we have geographical challenges as well. We have spatial challenges as well. We have urbanization as well. So for example, a siren system would not completely work for the entire Dutch St. Martin. So in that sense, a component of the project for St. Martin includes a study to also determine the most suitable type of system that would serve on St. Martin. Of course, we don't expect it to be just one approach. It has to be a layered approach, similar to what Reno indicated. Some might get an SMS, some might not. We also have persons in a community that are challenged with hearing. We have persons in the community that are challenged in sight. So it has to be a multi-layered approach to early warning. Another component of the project with regards to early warning for St. Martin is also basically the risk analysis of St. Martin. So we have similar that has been done here. As a matter of fact, the UNDRR also supported St. Martin with a situational analysis component in developing your early warning system. Another component, and then I will stop there, Edward, before I take up too much time. Another component for early warning in St. Martin is harmonizing the emergency services. So with emergency services, I'm talking about fire, ambulance, and police. Those three core emergency services on St. Martin. When you have an early warning system, you have to know who is responsible for what, who will do what, who will react when. Therefore, a governance framework would solidify all of that, as well as solidify it for the Emergency Operations Center, who is the disaster management structure for emergency response in the event of a hazard on St. Martin. So we have several components in our project. to which a knowledge and attitude test is also part of it, because you need to know what messaging gets through to your population more. You have to know what language to use when you're speaking to your population. So that messaging, knowing how to develop and what to poise in those messages is also very critical.
No, thank you, Angelique. A very similar point to the one you just made now was made by Dr. Clervaux from the Turks and Caicos Islands during the high-level event organized on the World Meteorological Day back in March of this year. So it's very consistent with this. I realized that this conversation is very rich, and I think we have a few more points I think would be great to discuss as part of this forum today. With your permission, we can extend a little bit longer until the latest 11:30 AST, if that's okay with you. Just because I think we've got this lot of points that we can still that can be shared here. I have a hand raised. I'll take one question here, and then I'll come back to Judy on the issue of the challenges as far as gender dimensions. Graciela from Curacao, you have a question or a point?
Yes, good morning, good afternoon. I had a question. On Curacao, we're also looking into coming with an early warning system. But for us, it's about also understanding the risk. But how do the panelists see the theme of education also? Because you have the early warning system, but people have to know what to do. Shahir mentioned his mother asked him, okay, what does the hurricane mean for me? And he gave the example about the school. So I would like to know, how could you incorporate the early warning system and the education team, make it together so that people would understand risk better?
Fayed, would you like to answer that question?
Sure, I was looking forward for it. No, thank you, Graciela. I think that is a very pertinent question, and I think that I would like to mention something here that is very important for the Caribbean region. The Caribbean region has been really a leading region worldwide in many initiatives. For instance, the Caribbean region, and now San Martin is the chair uh, of the Caribbean Safe School Initiative, on which one we try to incorporate disaster risk reduction and resilience within the education sector. So it's about talking not only school safety, talking about the walls and about the building itself, but it's about how we prepare at the school level and how we really mainstream on curricular and non-curricular activities everything that is related to disaster risk reduction. It's how we can really teach our kids that disasters are not natural, that doesn't exist, that disasters are social constructions, and that we can work all together in order to really make that the hazards will not translate on disasters. So I think that the Caribbean region, including some of the countries there, we have Curacao is part of the Caribbean School Safety Initiative, San Martin as well. I just mentioned the chairs. So it's working in order to really ensure that in formal educations, we have already, kids that will understand these concepts of risk, but also that they understand how to react in the concept of an emergency. This in one side. On the other side is about the non-formal education. It's how we reach out of the school people, elderly, immigrants, displaced people, people that does not speak our language. So how we can inform and raise awareness to other ones that are part of, that are, let's say, out of the normal people of the community, but that will need more specificities in the way how we target the message to them. So, and this is where we will need to really continue on promoting and strengthening raise awareness campaigns, ensuring that we're going to disseminate warnings on different language. We know in the Caribbean region, we have a diversity of language. We have Spanish, Dutch, we have English, we have French. So we need to be ensured that, most of the people that are there understand what are the hazards that are exposed, and that they understand a sign is related to an early warning system. We have a lot of tourists coming to our islands. So we really need to inform them how to react in the case that a specific emergency will come. So I guess that is going through the formal education through the education sector, through the school safety initiative, working with them on the formal curricula, extracurricular activities, but going in the non-formal education in order that everybody understands what are the hazards that they are exposed and to understand what are the actions that they need to be undertaken when a warning is presented there. Over to you, Graciela, or to Edward.
Yes, thank you very much for your explanation. I appreciate it. Those some of those things we already are doing it through our website, social media, etc. But the thing is, on the island, we're very blessed. We're such a very blessed island. Aruba also, not much happens. So for us, it's quite difficult to have the people understanding is one, but also taking the action is another one. So maybe in another session, we could go more in depth about how do you persuade that people take the action, even though nothing will happen, just to be prepared, for example, because we don't have hurricanes like St. Martin has, thank God, but we are always all focusing on preparedness, preparedness, preparedness.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sure Reno also. I remember Reno when we met in person back in 2019 was explaining how, in the context of Aruba, how they mobilize the different stakeholders for this and maintaining a certain level of sort of keeping it always fresh and training and making sure that these issues it's not a one-off and not one-off kind of technical training that's required, but more of a continuous process and engaging all the stakeholders. If you allow me, I would like to now go back to Judy. Judy, you started explaining a little bit about, well, the importance of this gender responsiveness in programming and so forth. Maybe if you could share with us some specific challenges that you've observed in the Caribbean region to implement gender responsive early warning and early action.
Yeah, sure. I think just broadly, a challenge or a barrier is the skepticism and limited understanding about the value of gender mainstreaming early warning systems. Because, some may say that early warning systems are designed for everyone, everyone, men, women, children. So that should be sufficient and effective, but we know that that's not the case. So then that translates to limited, meaningful consultation of both men and women in the design of early warning systems, and then the lack of systematic and consistent collection of data disaggregated by sex. And another key variables of vulnerable groups like age, for example, and also limited gender considerations in post-disaster needs assessments, vulnerability and risk assessments and capacity assessments, hazard analyses, and adaptation planning. So these are like three sort of main challenges, which then have follow-on impacts to how these systems are designed and ultimately how they operate. There is one example from Guyana. So a grassroots women's advocacy organization that they had noted that women who braved waist deep and even chest deep contaminated floodwaters to care for and provide safety for their families and neighbors during the floods in 2005, 2006. They were not consulted by government officials on the design of flood management initiatives. They weren't even consulted after the fact, when the government went ahead and interviewed men about the impacts of the flooding on their lives and livelihoods. So, like I said, women weren't consulted before or even after. And in this instance, if they had been consulted in the design of early warning systems, particularly with regard to this flooding, remembering that early warning systems include understanding the risk and having the capacity to respond appropriately, then perhaps they would have had the correct information about the potential extent of the flooding, and considerations to their health, not just their lives, could have translated into more effective actions like evacuation, or even having small boats or flotation devices made available to households, so that they didn't have to wade through contaminated water.
Yeah, thank you for that illustration. I mean, also to add maybe another example, maybe not from this region, but from Asia in Nepal, and illustrating the point that women often do not have equal access to technology, to communication and services, and thus may sometimes actually miss out on critical information. So this study conducted in Nepal revealed that 71% of men received the early warning information through a formal source. But if you compare that to women, 51% of women declared receiving information through informal social sources, such as word of mouth from community or family members. So these are things which are essential to really study and understand and design programs appropriately. I mentioned Dr. Clervaux's presentation at the World Meteorological Day back in March, and she was giving examples of Turks and Caicos and how, as part of how they've actually tried to address this issue as part of, and some very concrete initiatives, such as how they've mainstream gender in the National Disaster Work Program, how they've also made sure that there is meaningful participation of both men and women, and promoting actually leadership as well as part of their program and their approach. So thank you for those contributions, Judy. Okay, you may have seen in the chat area, I've added a little link to a YouTube video and also a timestamp in there where you can actually listen to the presentation made by Elizabeth Riley, the Executive Director of SEDIMA, presented back in Bali. And you can learn more about, she gives an overview of the Caribbean and some of the work that's done, the structured stepwise approach that they have employed. I think Clive, who was with us earlier on, dropped out. But okay, that presentation will really, it's not very long, but you will get to know more about how SEDIMA is also supporting. You'll know more about the checklist. They've adapted the existing UNDR checklist specifically with a Caribbean flavor. And you'll find out more also about how the initiatives in investing in science and the strategic guidance and policy that they've been providing and so forth. So the link is there if you're interested to know more about SEDIMA's support in this area. Okay, I realize it's 11:24 now. Maybe we have if the panelists agree, maybe we have scope for two last questions or comments. See if does anybody want to. Reno, maybe you wanted to add a point to what you've shared so far.
Yeah, hearing the whole, as you say, you gave it the thought, the Caribbean flavor. The climate change that the world is concerned about for the Caribbean islands, we have the food security too as a add-on. So if we talk about early warning and early action, we have to take in consideration the food security going to be an issue in the coming years in front of us. And as the Caribbean basin, we are confronting a lot of risk hazards that the developed countries have to give a hand to help us at least survive what is coming in our ways. Because if we take East Caribbean, Dominica, that export banana, and they are in the hurricane track, so every year they have the risk to lose their harvest. So for the Aruba, if we get a good hit, we lose our tourist pillar, and then we don't have. And I agree with St. Martin. In Aruba, we have safety schools plan. We have 84 schools with the crisis team. They now can identify risk mitigate the risk at their own school. And if they don't have the capacity, they will step up to our organization to give help. So as we said in the beginning, no one left behind, but that is the whole scope, not only in life-saving life infrastructure, but in response to our Caribbean community have to embrace. We're gonna help everybody put hands and shoulder under the risk that we confronted yearly, and not hope for the best. We're gonna be Resilience 2030, a Caribbean Basin Resilience 2030, and that is with the support of funds, international funds, with support of expertise worldwide to help this basin. And if I said every time words, we have done a lot of research. Now it's time for action, and action is costing money. So we are seeking for more funds to get a Resilience Caribbean 2030.
Thank you, Reno. Any last words, Jair or Angelique? Anyone? Angelique?
So I want to thank the RESEMBID program, the EU Expertise France, because as Reno indicated, climate change is real. I think as a region, we are feeling the brunt of it already. Ways that we try to tackle it is through these projects. So we're very much grateful for that. In regards to the safe schools, I would say to Curacao, standard operating procedures, practice, practice, practice. Even if it doesn't happen, when it does happen, if at least there's some sort of training went on. One of the things that we are trying to do right now as well is to anchor all of these projects through a higher vision, which is our national development vision. And disaster management, of course, is one of the disaster risk management is one of the visionary goals for protecting our people, because as Reno said, climate change is real, and that is our biggest threat to us as small island states. So other than that, that's it for me.
Thank you, Angelique.
But for my part, Edward, I will just say that it is very important that we open these conversations to other sectors in our islands. Disaster risk reduction is not only the responsibility of the disaster management agencies in each of the islands, but it's everybody's responsibility. So we need to involve, the private sector. We need to involve all of the sectors: agriculture, health, education. We need to involve them all because we need a systemic approach really cope with systemic risk. The example that Reno was mentioned about climate change, yeah, we see the impacts today, but we cannot imagine about how the understanding of risk will be necessary there. We are talking in a very reductionist way about the negative impacts of climate change, that we're going to have our coastal areas flooded, but we need to start thinking about other issues that will happen there, like climate migration, climate displacement. We're going to have a lot of heat waves that will come and that will bring other epidemics, will bring other mosquitoes. So there are issues that we need to link early warning systems that come from hydrometeorological hazards with those, for instance, that come from biological hazards. SCARFA in the region is working a lot on this. And this is why the recommendation is, let's open your sector and make sure that the agenda is not only your agenda, but it's the agenda of the whole islands. It's everybody's business, and this is the big call that we would like to have. Early warning systems like disaster risk reduction is everything is about governance, and everything is about bringing all of the partners together and all of the sectors together and the stakeholders, and also ensuring, as Judy has mentioned, that everybody really is covered, that no one is left behind, and that means understanding the different capacities that different people, for instance, elderly or children have, or the different, or how disasters affect traditionally and culturally different women and men. And this is something that we need to incorporate. And for that, it's important to open it to all of the sectors, but also to open to understand the visions and perceptions of the end users. So thank you for the invitation. It has been a pleasure to be here. And I really hope for any further collaboration.
Thank you, Jair. And I mean, this has been a truly rich and very broad discussion. I know we've only touched the surface on many of these topics, and we could certainly, I imagine, organize a whole week-long event if we wanted to look at this in more depth. But I think this has been a really useful conversation. And to wrap up, maybe some of the key takeaways of this. I mean, we discussed the importance, obviously, in investing in early warning systems. That, I mean, we have in terms of saving lives. I mean, this was brought up in the initial presentation. You know that over the last 50 years, we've recorded a five-fold increase in the number of disasters. But at the same time, thanks to investments in preparedness and early warning systems, in terms of loss of life, this figure has reduced threefold. So it's definitely, and we saw in that video at the beginning, an investment, investing $800 million a year could potentially save $16 billion a year. So there's a real case for this. We also know that there's still quite a long way to go to make sure that we do reach the target of leaving no one behind. We heard about the COP27 coming up in November, and an action plan will be presented there. And I think the voice also of the Caribbean will be represented at that event. And yeah, SEDIMA, I mentioned the themes that the recurring themes that SEDIMA has identified for the Caribbean region, suggesting the systematic challenges that need to be addressed. And yeah, so yeah, it's truly been a pleasure moderating this session today. Several of you will be participating in International Day of Disaster Risk Reduction tomorrow. So I wish you some fruitful discussions, and that all your endeavors will assist your country and territory to achieve the target of early warnings for all within the next 5 years. So a message of appreciation to all the panelists and all of you who've made time out of your busy schedules to join the community of practice today. Again, a special thanks to the implementing partners and the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.